Hello everybody, it's Jade. This week we're covering chapters 10.x through 11.8 of Pact. It's kind of interesting covering these chapters because none of them are the end of an arc, so we're really just getting a bunch of setup and character work that doesn't resolve anything in particular, but I think it's good to sometimes just have these sections that contain no major arc-ending battles and no massive cliffhangers. Okay, there's a massive cliffhanger in this, but it could be, based on the placement of this cliffhanger, it could be resolved in the next chapter, and I just don't know it. So let's get started. So the first chapter in this section is 10.x, which is Andy's interlude, gathered pages, collection of notes. And we learn a lot about what witch hunters are like. We had a pretty good guess of what they do and stuff, based on what we've seen of Andy and Eva so far. But in general, it seems like they just do what I'm always wishing everybody would do at all times. You know, sometimes when Blake and Rose encounter a problem, I'm thinking, just light it on fire. Just blow it up. Just make a pipe bomb and blow it up. And it was really awesome that one time that Mags used a pipe bomb to solve her problems. I thought that was sick as shit. But that's Andy and Eva's daily life. And that's pretty neat. They also talk to each other. They talk to the other witch hunters. They don't seem to have these major political power grabs and stuff, which is really refreshing because personally I have a tough time with like politics and understanding complex social systems like that. So it's, even though I'm not having a particularly tough time following the power grabs in Pact, it's refreshing to not have to, and to be in the head of somebody that just doesn't worry about that shit as much. They also figured out all by themselves what happened to Blake just by sitting down and having an evening conversation, probably over dinner, which Rose and her cabal didn't, despite the fact that they, between the five of them, know basically all there is to know about Blake. What's not cool is the murder that they're always committing. That's certainly a mark against them, I would say. They seem to have no real justification for the killing that they do, other than this could be a problem later, which is not awesome. You know, killing somebody just because they could be a problem at a later time is not a good reason to kill them. Yeah, it's not a good look. And speaking of not good looks, Andy spends a whole lot of his narration talking about how he seems to be borderline suicidal. He kind of fantasizes about his problems being over. He has no self-esteem. He doesn't want to affect the world. He's not, his life is miserable, and he doesn't really have any moments of joy. He doesn't have something that he's doing that he can look forward to. And at the end of the chapter, he reassures himself by fantasizing about showing up to a public place and blowing up everybody inside. Now, I like Andy in general, but this is not a good look, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're gonna show up to a public place and blow up everybody inside, the practitioners are a great target. Like, don't get me wrong, fantastic, but they aren't. But it's not something that he should really be doing in general. At the end of this section, he breaks into Hillsglade House and starts trying to either disable or kill everybody inside. And he does so on the order of the council. I think Andy and Eva probably, or at least Andy, probably really needs to reevaluate what they want their role in Jacob's Bell to be. Um, Breaking into people's houses and trying to kill the people in it um, certainly would make you believe that the people ordering you to do so are bad. Um, so maybe you should evaluate whether that's a job you want to continue to have. Also, in hindsight, at the beginning of Pact, Rose was really trying to get Blake to consider becoming a witch hunter, or both of them becoming witch hunters. Um, Knowing that she has been trying to secure her ability to lie up until Arc 8, it makes sense that she would want to be a witch hunter because witch hunters are capable of lying. Maybe that's not the exact reason that she wanted to do it, but I think it did play a role. But we'll never know. So in 11.1, after a few hours of isolation, Blake is visited by Ty and Evan. And I just want to say, I adore Ty. I've brought this up a couple of times. Ty's not a huge character. He doesn't have much of a character arc that you are supposed to be super invested in. You don't. I mean, you might want to know whether he lives or dies, but beyond that, he doesn't have any particular goals that we're supposed to be keeping track of. But in general, I just really adore him as a person. Because when he sees something that he can do that's helpful, he just fucking does it. The very first thing that we see him do in the whole book that made me have faith that there are good people in this universe is he offered to help Blake finish the runes in his apartment. Holy shit. I mean, that was the first kind act we saw in Pact. In this scene, he sees that Blake is lonely, and he decides to bring him a deck of cards and start talking to him. And then later in this section, Blake breaks a window, and he volunteers to start repairing it. He just sees that something can be done, and he's like, you know what? I'm going to solve that problem. He's really almost completely unique in having this quality of wanting to help a situation be better in small ways, and not even consciously wanting it, but just saying, there's a problem that I could solve. Let me solve it. I like Ty a lot. Also, notably in this conversation, he says that he sees that the connection between Blake and Evan still exists, but he doesn't specify what exactly the nature of that connection is or what it entails. So, Faisal said that some of Blake's connections were healing. It seems that Evan is one of those. There's got to be something to this, but I don't know what it is. There's a somewhat hilarious little moment in this section where Evan accuses Blake of being in love with Green Eyes, someone that we know Blake has only spoken to a little bit, but it just adds a moment of levity in this chapter that is largely a moment of levity, but it keeps the story from feeling like it's just darkness all the time. So then they leave, and then a little while later, Tiffany comes in. And I think it's important to note that in Arc 10, when Blake returns to Hillsglade House, he doesn't even tell Tiffany that they ever went on a date, which I appreciate / admire, because it would have been easy for him to try to win some points in that conversation by saying, hey, Tiffany, you and I used to date, and then be vague about how serious that was, to make Tiffany believe that she should be more interested in his future and what happens to him. But he doesn't. But that also seems to come from a genuine lack of interest in Tiffany, because in that same conversation, he does refer to loving Alexis. In fact, I believe that she is the only person he has referred to as loving. I might be wrong on that, but I'm 90% sure. So in this conversation, when he's talking about the friendship that they had at one point, he lets it slip that they went on a date, but he's not doing it in any kind of manipulative way. At the beginning of this conversation, he is being fairly manipulative, and it is really irritating to read. But he really gets himself under control, and that is nice. But when he lets slip that they had gotten coffee before, she sort of fucks him with her eyes, and I just busted out laughing, right? So I've mentioned before that I don't really care about Tiffany, like, at all. But at this point, when she looks at this tree man and thinks, man, I wish I could remember whether I had sex with that thing, she just skyrocketed from person that I don't care about to completely in line with the rest of the cast for me. After this point, I just cared more about Tiffany. I like her. And then, of course, these two conversations prepare us to expect that Blake will have a third conversation with Alexis, because rule of three. But he breaks out before that, but it prepares us in our mind for, he's going to be talking to Alexis, which makes the rest of the chapters covered in this arc feel really significant. So Blake discovers that his body is changing and begins to explore some of these physical changes. And we get to reason number 5,876,881 why I would not survive in the Pact universe. Upon the discovery that I had little puffballs on my arms that chirp and seem to mimic my emotions, I would pet them and talk to them and give them scritches behind their little heads. I would certainly never ever use them for voodoo. It would be too much for me emotionally. Rest in peace, Lefty. Still, it is cool that he's able to use the spirits in this way. This just occurred to me. I don't really think it's right, but Blake is able to consume images of himself that Face also supplied to gain more energy and to gain more Blakeness. I wonder if Evan could merge with any of the bird spirits to replenish his energy or connection to Blake. Because we know that Evan's bird form is based on these, like, bird spirits that he has on his tattoos and stuff. So, I don't know, just an idea. So Blake uses the little birds to break out. He takes Evan and they go to a nearby Bahame family house and eavesdrop on some conversation. And we'll have more to say about what the Bahames are deciding later. But for now, I just want to say, I fucking hate the Bahames, right? And the new number 578th reason why I hate the Bahames is... So Ben is making all of these points, and Ben is old enough to be retired, and I'm assuming he's been a practitioner for his entire life, like most of the Bahames. And he's speaking to the other members of the Bahame family about why he believes that they should choose Timothy over Alistair. And he has some intelligent points, and yes, they do come from Blake, but he's saying things that make sense. He's not just running his mouth. And they say, and at some point, eventually somebody shuts him up and says, "Sorry, Ben, you aren't an elder in this family, so you don't really get to speak. It's time for you to sit down and shut up." And that just drives me up the fucking wall. It is a personal pet peeve of mine when somebody tells me or anybody else that, sorry, you don't have the correct rank or age or whatever to be considered in this discussion. And it's really because we don't want to hear from you or we don't like your points, but we're going to pull rank and say that you have to shut up. Just drives me up the wall. It probably has something to do with the fact that I like to talk, something you may have noticed about me up to this point. So Evan does a little bit of a betrayal of Rose, I guess, kind of, by going with Blake to go snoop on the Bahames. But that is nothing compared to what we see out of the Bahame familiars in this chapter. They say that they love their partners. I'm not sure what the opposite of familiar is. I want to say master, but I'm not sure that's the case, especially in the general sense, because there's so many cases where the familiar is in control. But the Bahame familiars seem shockingly non-dedicated to being on the same page and fulfilling mutual desires with their practitioner counterparts. And in this exchange, their motives are quite selfish. I mean, yes, some of the possible outcomes here do benefit the Behames, but that's not what they're saying. They see people spying and give the spies information. I mean, there's not much. If the practitioner counterparts of these familiars found out, I'm sure they would either be devastated or livid. And it just brings up a side of the whole familiar bond that we haven't really talked about up to this point, which has several components. For one, the idea of being betrayed by your familiar is pretty terrifying. Familiars have been compared to spouses several times in the story. And your familiar betraying you is roughly on par with your spouse betraying you, right? They're a life partner, probably a life partner that you've known for longer than your spouse if you picked a familiar at the age of 12 and you got married at 27 or whatever. And then these familiars don't appear to have a particular amount of loyalty to their partners. They do, but it seemed more like a loyalty that's bought. They made a deal. It reminded me, maybe this sounds like a harsh comparison, but this is just what I thought of. It reminds me of prostitution. They want to be corporeal for some amount of time, so they agree to work for this person for a period of time, but there isn't a reciprocated level of emotional connection between the two partners. And also the familiars remain mostly static through the course of their practitioner's life. But the practitioners change, especially if they meet their familiar quite young. And that can cause a very interesting relationship, I think. It's like a marriage, I guess, except one party is not as invested because they've been married 1,000 times before, and this is just 1001. And finally, it lends a kind of specialness to the connection between Evan and Blake. One, neither of them have been anybody's long-term partner before. Blake hasn't even been in a serious or long-term relationship as far as we know. And two, Evan will leave the world when Blake does. We're not 100% sure on that anymore, but based on what Ty said about their connection repairing, etc., we can assume that is probably still the case if they talk about it later. So this is much more like a regular marriage where the two people intend to have only one partner for the remainder of their life. Although interestingly, as they're leaving this conversation, Blake thinks to himself, the Behames sought to be on top and then make everything work out, which is actually exactly what the familiars were doing there, sort of. So Blake goes to the school, and Alistair challenges him to a duel, but before we get to that, I just want to point something out. So listen to this passage. My eye fell on one young man, 18 apparently. He had the Behame look, dark-haired, with very strong features, a little taller than average. His features, though, weren't so blocky as the other Behames. Strong cheekbones and a prominent chin and an odd face shape. He wore a leather jacket with a heavy wool scarf tucked inside it. The way his hair was styled, the narrow jeans and the shiny black boots, something told me that he was a Toronto resident, not a kid who'd lived in a small town all his life. His eyes were a bottle glass green as he peered at me. As smug as he was, a thin-lipped snake's grin would have fit him, but he had very full lips, as characteristic of many Behames. When he spoke, it was with confidence. You can tell we're in it for the long haul with Alistair because we haven't gotten this level of physical description from anybody else, other than Buttsack. We even got his eye color. The only other character whose eye color we know, I'm pretty sure, is Green Eyes, whose eyes are green. The only thing we know about Alexis's appearance is that she is small, she has a ponytail, and she has acne. That is nothing compared to the level of description we get about Alistair Behame here. I could make another joke about maybe Blake's love interest is actually this person because they are described ad nauseum and we get to know about Alistair's lips and stuff, but I think I've used that one enough. So, during this fight, Alistair uses a lot of see the future magic. Like he is using his implement to see the future a crazy amount, constantly. And I have to wonder how much magic this is using. It has to be a lot. And I feel like he is using a lot of magic because later on in this fight, he turns back time 6 seconds to remove what could become a scar on his face. Something. And earlier in the discussion that they were listening in on between the Behaim elders, Ben suggested that Alistair could have been lying to make himself look better, to make the rest of the family feel more confident in him. And that's very similar to what Alistair does here when he turns back time to make his face prettier. He doesn't want to lose face with the rest of the Behaims. So he makes his face look invincible. How much magic did that use? I am wondering whether the bell tolling that Molly started makes the Behaims more powerful. Because the counting was making Ainsley's binding more powerful. And so I feel like this constant rhythm in the background of the entire town has to be doing something to improve the Behaim's ability to draw on magic. But, at the same time, it may also be impeding them because it screws with their ability to change people's perceptions of time. Don't know. Over the course of this fight, we see demonstrated that Alistair definitely has the potential to be one scary motherfucker. Like, he definitely has skill and he definitely has talent. But that doesn't mean he's unbeatable. At this point, when he's still in high school, we see him stumble over information that he didn't know he should have checked for. Or rather, he stumbles over information about something that happened when he wasn't around. Something that he probably could have asked about if he had thought to ask it, but he didn't. For him to see something coming, he has to actually ask the question. So right now, he's young and relatively inexperienced in both conflict and combat. And he is only going to get better at both of those things. So if Alistair is going to be beaten, he has to be beaten sooner rather than later. He cannot be allowed to become the head of the Behaim family and sit on the council for years and years. The way to beat him now is effectively to have somebody be willing to take the consequences of forswearing him. And nobody wants to do that at the moment, and it would definitely suck for whoever's doing it. But as he gets older and as he grows in experience, his blind spots will shrink and become fewer in number. So, yeah. So Blake returns to Hillsglade House after the duel, which is put on hold, or considered to be a draw. If this is considered to be a draw, I'm not sure what that means for Blake's beating 3 people 3 times or whatever. So I hope that this fight can be resumed at a later time so that Blake can stomp him. Assuming that Blake would stomp him, I'm not sure. So he returns to Hillsglade House and he talks to Rose, and they fight. Shocker. And then he talks to Alexis, and he gives her this speech where he makes her understand that she has an effect on the world, which is what she wants. We've talked about how the thing that she wants most may not to have an effect on people and an effect on the world, but it is certainly something that she wants, particularly with her choice of career and identity as a tattoo artist. Tattoo artists, by definition, mark people in ways that are permanent. With what we find out about Alexis in this section, and what we see here in this conversation, I have to believe that Blake is based on a living person, or is just some transmutation of a living person. And it starts with the fact that she remembers the week that she did Blake's tattoos as being a slow week. It screams memory block to me. If Blake had never existed, that slow week wouldn't have happened. But the work that she did during that week was erased. Something must have happened during that time, I think. And this is the point when I stopped believing that it's possible that Blake was never a person. He had the apartment, he had the motorcycle, and Alexis couldn't stop weeping for him when he disappeared. We find out from Tiffany that the reason the Cabal went with Rose is because Alexis was suffering from nightmares and an inability to sleep for reasons she didn't understand, and Rose was able to magically cure this. That's not a 2-week-old connection. Whatever Granny Rose did, if she created Blake out of thin air, I seriously doubt that it would have affected Alexis in this way. And then finally, this conversation ends by Alexis smiling at him with her lips closed, the same way that she smiles to everybody else. And obviously, we don't expect this to be any different, but it is just an additional note of heartbreak, because in the very first scene that Alexis is in, we see that he is the only person she's willing to show her fucked up teeth to when they are in private. And he no longer holds that place. And it appears that no one does. So then the rest of the Thorburns show up. And I'd like to take a moment to apologize to Paige. Paige is lovely and a sweetheart. And she doesn't deserve to have anyone saying bad things about her. Not even me. So, we just talked about how it appears that Blake did exist. Now let's talk about how it looks like Rose did not. Blake had the apartment and the motorcycle, but we find out in this conversation that Rose has nothing. She talks about how she is wearing Granny Rose's clothes because all of her clothes were destroyed. Destroyed. They never existed. The clothes never existed. Wherever she went to college, she can't go back there, or it doesn't occur to her to be able to go back there to get her belongings. Something that she probably had the opportunity to do between leaving Toronto and going to Jacobsville. So, there's something interesting going on there. Such as the fact that she never went to college. Uncle Paul says here that she only has a high school education. Now maybe he's just being mean and discounting whatever college education she might have, but she's old enough to be in her 3rd year of college. Most people don't consider that to be only a high school education. The rest of Rose's family doesn't object to this, and they refer to her as a loser. You would think at minimum that one of her parents would say, no, our daughter is fit to be the inheritor of this estate because she has a bright future. But they don't. We do know they're trying to take the house away, but there is no mention of anything that Rose has been doing beyond her relationships with the others. She never existed. She never existed. So now let's talk about the rest of the fucking Thorburns. I think it's important to be kind and giving to others. You may have noticed that I'm always talking up Ty and Alexis and Evan as being good people who want to help. And I love it when Blake emulates those qualities in them. I think being willing to help others when they need you is one of the most admirable traits a person can have. But taking stuff when you don't need it drives me up the fucking wall. Coasting on the kindness of others, or worse, taking things away from them, is one of the lowest forms of human to me. Personally, even if a family member wins the lottery and you start to try to manipulate your way into getting some of their money or even suing them, that makes me ridiculously angry. So this scene successfully pissed me off. But even if your personal pet peeve isn't someone coasting on someone else's hard work, I am sure that most readers have some kind of pet peeve that is triggered by this conversation, because it's long, and almost every single line of it is unpleasant. But as much as that's a pet peeve, this scene also touched on one of my largest phobias, and that's the idea of being committed against your will. So I watched this TED Talk once from a guy that was the head psychiatrist in this psychiatric ward. And there was a man that was in this ward who had been there for 20 years, and he behaved perfectly normally the entire time. He didn't need the help of any aides. He got along well with the nurses and so on. But he refused to let this man out of the psychiatric hospital. And when asked why, he said, well, the fact that he's going out of his way to act normal in front of us means that he's a sociopath. In other words, there is literally nothing that this man could do in 20 years to find his way out of this psychiatric ward. And this is a phenomenon that we see in the news all the time. There was one study, and I should have looked this up before to get a citation, but they sent 50 people into this psychiatric evaluation center with no symptoms, that they were all perfectly healthy, but they each had a note in their file that another doctor had said they may have been hearing voices. The people were perfectly healthy. They reported no symptoms when they went in and spoke with the doctors. But of the 50 people, 49 of them were committed for having schizophrenia, although they observed no symptoms in the patient. I have no faith in the mental health system here or anywhere else in the world. And the idea of losing your agency because someone else thinks that you might have a disease that you could be faking not having is fucking terrifying, especially when your family can commit you. The worst part of this is Rose is an adult. Rose isn't even a child, and her family still has this level of control over her that they can just go to the police and say, here's our daughter, she's fucking insane, take her, lock her away for as long as possible, and there's effectively nothing Rose can do about it. At this point, if I were in her shoes, I don't think I could trust myself to be in this situation, because I would start throwing things, and I would start acting insane to get out of this. This is bonkers. Probably I would have given up the house. This is terrifying to me. And she keeps saying that, and the family keeps saying, oh yeah, we'll make sure that you get out after this is all over. Do you trust the Thorburns, audience? Do you think the Thorburns are going to make sure that everything is cleared up with Rose? I don't. I don't think they will, and I don't think they care. So that made me hate all of them more than anything. But there are a few things good that come out of this. Particularly in the department of the relationship between Blake and Rose. Something that I personally kind of thought was beyond repair after she locked him in a mirror and didn't intend to let him out for a couple of weeks. But for one, at first she doesn't refer to him as a member of the family. She says someone. And then throughout the course of the conversation, she eventually says, just stop. I know the details. A member of this family pointed me in the right direction a little earlier. So she calls him family here. It's not a big deal, but it is an improvement. She does believe him, and she is willing to trust his information. And then we get this section, which I believe is the biggest display of empathy we've seen between these two, or from Blake to Rose in the entire book. He says, she was divulging information she maybe shouldn't. She was divulging information she maybe shouldn't. In fact, she was very much the egomaniacal villain from the movies and kids' cartoons, who explained far too much of their master plan. I wondered momentarily about that. She was falling back on the little bit of conquest that was inside her. Why? Because she was scared, or hurt. If I put myself in her shoes, it would have sucked, knowing that Dad hadn't been on the up and up when he said he genuinely wanted to be a family. This is the most he has actually thought about what Rose wants and what Rose is thinking, and actually come down positively on her behavior, despite the fact that she's doing something that he very much disagrees with. It actually gave me hope. So in order to help with this, Blake starts breaking a bunch of windows and acting spooky. And he even cuts one of his cousins on the forehead on accident. And he feels stronger after this, which is, I believe, the first confirmation we've gotten that Blake actually does get stronger from scaring people. And that is not good. So Blake really needs to find out what he is and what Rose knows about what he is, because he's going to run out of energy soon unless he starts acting like a terrorist. Because, he thrives on terror is all he knows. There are very few ways he can actually gain power by scaring people, such as Ellie, safely. It's really just preventing crimes and scaring people out of dangerous situations, as far as I can think of. So here's an out-of-left-field prediction. If there's ever an attack on the school or danger to the school, which I do think is going to happen at some point, the part that I'm not sure would happen is I think Blake could go through and scare the children to get them to hurry out or to get them to get away from the danger. And this would provide him with lots and lots of energy because he would be scaring many people at the same time. Unfortunately, that's something that he could only do once, so that's not extra viable, but still. So Callan, we've really only seen Callan be influenced by others, and outsiders, not others. So at one point he says, I'm going to go use the facilities, then I'll put something over that broken window if you just tell me where stuff is. Maybe Callan is redeemable because he actually volunteers to help here. We don't actually see him help, but he does allude to potentially helping. So, of all the people to be able to hear Blake, it's Peter. And I'm sure this means something. Now, it's possible that it's just he has a connection with his twin sister who may or may not have been awakened at this point. We don't really know what Paige is doing right now because it's been a month. But I don't think that's it. Something about Peter makes him able to perceive magic, which is interesting. He also displays a really great amount of perceptiveness here. He talks to Alexis, and he's a massive dick the whole time. Like, I would never consider him to be innocent after that. But he comes away from the conversation warning the rest of the family that, hey, no, I think Alexis is serious and there is an actual threat here and we need to prepare. Now, nobody gives a shit, and they don't take this nearly as seriously as they should have based on where this is going. But Peter has the potential to be interesting. And on the topic of Callan potentially being willing to help, you know who's not? Catherine. And this is frustrating to me because Catherine is a grown-ass woman. Apparently she runs her own business, which is a restaurant. And restaurants require quite a lot of work and passion to be viable businesses. And she seems to have been running it for a while. But she can't be bothered to help around the house because she's a fucking princess. She is definitely one of the most tolerable members of the family. But that's a low fucking bar. Like, after this, Roxanne says, "Nah, I'm with you guys. It's gotta be better than TV with only 100 channels." Ugh. I hate these people. The Behames make the Thorburns look... I wanted to say like the Duchamps, but I can't really say the Duchamps look great. The Behames make the Thorburns look good. So Blake has always gotten energy from being around his friends. And we do see him become more Blakely when he hangs out with Ty and Tiff and Alexis independently throughout these chapters. Um, which makes the whole goodbye Blake scene hurt real bad, but also be very ominous, because it means that he's lost the one thing that really, really ties him to being himself. And I'm sure he can get some amount of that by being around Evan, but it can't nearly be as much as he gets from being around the friends that he has had this whole time. So I worry that he's going to have to rely more on acting like a bogeyman, which is something that he's going to have to do. But let's talk about this fight. For one, I want to start by saying I'm pretty sure that the Thorburns are going to try to sue Rose for putting them in danger by them being in the house when Andy attacked. Because they're a bunch of pieces of shit, and I hate them. But second of all, what the Cabal does is they summon some things, or they take some of the summons they have, and they send them after Andy and Eva. And Andy and Eva pull a reverse card and know you, one of the summons back at the Cabal. And it goes really, really badly. So they are fighting this diary girl who has books made of flesh and her skin made of paper. And she is able to death by 1,000 paper cuts her opponents, in this case, Ty, Tiff, and Alexis. And it's really, really bad. It shows us what it's like to be on the opposite end of fighting Rose and co. But in general, this is just a very dire situation. It shows us that the Cabal definitely can't defend Hillsglade House, which is what they're supposed to be doing while Rose is in the mental asylum. But in this fight, we see that Blake has no such module as what if Alexis dies. When she is put in danger, everything else goes out the window. He doesn't listen to her anymore. She at one point tells him to leave and go get help, or go try to solve one of the other problems. And in his narration, he literally does not even consider the sentence that she just said. It just skips directly over the concept of leaving Alexis at this time. It is only once Alexis makes it clear to him that the only chance for her survival is for him to leave and stop the onslaught that he actually makes the decision to leave. So I want to talk about the concept of death in fiction. So recently there's been a bit of an uptick in the popularity of these epic series where there are a lot of characters and they can get killed at any time. Game of Thrones is one, but the influence of that and the influence from that has spilled over into a lot of other things. So for a while I was very involved in the My Hero Academia fandom, and it's a long-running manga with a very large cast of characters who do a lot of fighting, and for the first large chunk of the story, people get seriously hurt, and there are consequences to the fights, but nobody dies. And the fan base, and the people who weren't really fans but were just watching it so they could complain, started to complain a lot about the fact that no one died. They said that it felt like there were no stakes. It felt like everyone was safe. And eventually it came to the point where there were very real, very visceral consequences to some of the fights that ended people's futures and ended relationships between people. But the fan base continued to complain that there was no death because it wasn't real enough. Now that's bullshit. In real life, other than when you're driving, you very rarely make decisions whose consequences are life and death. The decisions that you're really concerned about are things like, is this going to cost me my job? Is this going to make me a promotion? Or is it going to cost me the friendship with some of my coworkers? Could this improve my relationship with my spouse, or could doing this ruin my life? death isn't the only consequence in real life. Bad things happen to people and in people's lives all the time that is not them dying. In fact, bad things can happen to people over and over and over again until they die, at which point bad things can't happen to them anymore. So the concept that you have to be killing your characters left and right in order for the fights and the interactions to have stakes doesn't make sense and doesn't hold water to me. There are certain series where it does make sense, but in general, I don't at all think that that's true. But of all the things that I just said, none of it applies to Alexis. In this conflict, Alexis is the one who very nearly dies. So I'm going to talk specifically about her. No amount of Alexis failing her goals or being locked out of a certain future or losing aspects of her personality or her memories holds a candle to the idea of her death to Blake. The idea that he can no longer protect her or no longer attempt to protect her is the only real concern that Blake displays. So in Arc 9, Blake sees this vision of Alexis crying over his death. And the conclusion that he draws from it is that he left the world a worse place than he came into it. If at the end of this encounter Alexis is dead, Blake can never achieve his goal of making the world a better place, because to him, Alexis is and represents the world. But on top of this, Alexis also represents his interest in and commitment to the values outlined in Black Lamb's Blood. That even in the face of a very, very cruel world, you should try to make a difference. If the in-story avatar of goodness in this world dies, it says something very potent about the ability for good to exist in the world of Pact. I'm not sure whether Alexis is dead at the end of this, but if she is, I believe that what follows will represent the actual rock bottom that Blake is capable of. And I'm not sure the character that we have followed up to this point can survive. Maybe his body can, but Blake cannot and can never be the same if he sees that what happens to people like Alexis and what happens to Alexis herself is that she gets killed. At an absolute minimum, he can never have the kind of conversation that he had with Faisal again, where he insists that humans are capable of causing good in the world, and that it's possible for human goodness to prevail. After this, Blake and Evan go try to stop the Council's onslaught on Hillsglade House by calling together a meeting with the Junior Council. Everybody is always trying to break the wheel in this story. But if you're always planning on how you're going to break the wheel, it's never going to happen. If you want to actually cause change, you have to start behaving as if things have changed. You have to start now. The best way to reliably create something new is to set aside a group of people who are, from this point on, going to now behave differently every single day. And they have to actually start doing it. If Blake is able to convince the Junior Council to change and to start doing things differently right now and in the future, this actually does have a chance of sticking. So that's all I have this week. Next week, starting with 11.9, in which we will see the climax of this arc, and hopefully that Alexis isn't dead. My actual prediction is that she's not dead, but that something bad probably happens to any combination of the three. I'm guessing if anybody's dead, it's Ty or Tiff. But I think that we are going to see a very different set of people from the rest of the Cabal the next time we see them, and it could actually be a while until we see them again. The potent goodbye there, I don't think is just going to be resolved by next chapter, them coming back and being like, "Oh, we're fine!" So, yeah. See you at the next one.